Welcome back to the Comics Cube, everyone. Today we are with Mark Russell, the controversial, irreverent, subversive Mark Russell. How are you doing?
Well, I'm doing good. That's quite an introduction. Hope I can live up to that.
Well, there's only been one controversy, really,
Yeah.
um, and that was very interesting. But before we get to that, I just want to ask, what attracts you to comics as a medium? Like, why comics?
Well, the thing that I discovered that I really liked about it after I started writing comics is that it's sort of, to me, the perfect balance between visual and interior medium,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that a film, everything's visual and everything's happening, and in a novel everything's sort of interior, and you're getting the thoughts of the protagonist, and it's all sort of inside your head. And comics is really a balance of both. You have the visuals, you have the artwork, but at the same time there's a lot of narration, there's a lot of like room for introspection and getting the internal emotions and thoughts of the characters in a way you can't really do with other visual mediums. So to me it's sort of the perfect balance of literature, which is where I'm from, and then like film. So I really like it for that reason.
You give us a background in your literature, on your literature background.
Well, I had written two books,
Mm-hmm.
non-comic books, before I got into writing comics, both of which are about the Bible. One called God is Disappointed
Yeah.
in You, which is a modern retelling of the Bible, and then another one along similar lines, called Apocrypha Now, which is about the non-canonical books of the Jewish and Christian religions that didn't quite make it into the Bible.
The first time I encountered your name was God is Disappointed in You, because I'm a big fan of Shannon Wheeler. So at the time, I
Oh,
actually thought
yeah.
of it as a Shannon Wheeler book.
It is. It is. It
Yeah.
is partially a Shannon Wheeler. He drew the cartoons,
So
but
how did
I wrote it.
that work? Did working with Shannon lead to you making comics? Because the pictures and the text do work together in those books, even if they are
Well,
prose books.
sort of. Yeah. I mean, it was. Initially, I was just planning to write it as a book without any cartoons, but Shannon was sort of the one that was like, oh, do cartoons, and we'll do a book together. And so we decided to um, do a book with cartoons and prose. And I thought for a long time that that's why I had been tapped to write the comic book prez for DC,
Mm-hmm.
which was my first comic book. But it wasn't until years later I learned from Marie Javins that that was in fact not the case. That it had nothing to do with the book that I'd written. It had to do with my Count Chocula fan fiction that I'd been posting on Facebook that she just happened to read and thought this guy would be good at a comic book. And that was why she contacted me and asked me if I'd be interested in writing prez. So it was a much more lucky and circuitous route to comics than I had even myself known.
That's I feel like there's a story there and a lesson to be learned from by aspiring writers.
I
That
think it's probably the opposite of a lesson. It's like you probably shouldn't try that. You probably shouldn't just start putting Count Chocula fan fiction on the internet expecting someone to find it and give you a job. But for me, that's how. But I think the lesson, maybe the takeaway, is that everything you create is sort of a lottery ticket.
Mhm.
That the more you create, the more you put out there. You never know who's going to see it. You never know which one's going to lead to your break.
So it's about volume.
Yeah, I think it is. It's
Yeah.
it's like you can be a mammal and give birth to one child and put all your love and care in, or you can be apparently like I was, like an insect, and give birth to 50,000 eggs, and maybe one of them survives.
In terms of writing, who would you say your biggest influences are?
I think the one growing up that really sort of made me want to write and sort of spoke to me the most was Kurt Vonnegut, the
Mhm.
novelist. And I think now probably my biggest influences are the all the nonfiction I'm reading, like all of the like you all know Harari's books, *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus*, make me really think about like the human condition and where we are going and why we are the way we are. And I try to like take the lessons I learned from books like that and like *Precipice*, which is a book I'm reading now about all the different ways humanity could potentially end, and think about how I could put that into like a funny parable or a story that would be worth reading.
So comedy is really, would you say comedy is your genre, or parody?
It's sort of the wavelength I naturally resonate on.
Hmm.
It's not really the only thing I write, but it's sort of, all things being equal, it's what I will probably gravitate towards.
So that's interesting because Snagglepuss, I wouldn't call it a comedy. Like if you
No, I think it's listed as a comedy book, but I think it's probably the least funny comedy ever written, because it's very sad. It's very, it's much more about the pain of having to live inauthentically.
how much, like how, okay, so this is how I reacted when I saw you doing Snagglepuss and the Flintstones, or when it was solicited. I said, no way. No way
Yeah.
are they gonna do this. Snagglepuss. And then before you know it, it's like making all the news and everything. I was like, no way, he did it, Snagglepuss.
Yeah, that's not an uncommon reaction. I think, if I hadn't been the one writing it, that's probably how I would have reacted to. Like, why are they even trying to do this? Why bother, making a Flintstones comic or a Snagglepuss comic? But for me, the answer was, well, because this is what I had the ability to write. This is what they were offering me to write. But it occurred to me that even though I wasn't a huge fan of the Flintstones, that there were things I liked about the Flintstones, and that I
Mhm.
could build a whole story around the things I wanted to say through the lens of the Flintstones.
Well, what about so they offered you Snagglepuss as
Yeah,
well?
Snagglepuss was actually a little different because I had already had the success, such as it were, with the Flintstones.
Hmm.
So we were probably gonna knew we were gonna do another project. I wasn't sure it was gonna be another Hanna-Barbera thing, but I had, just as a joke, been posting again on Facebook just sort of these dialogues between Huckleberry Hound and Snagglepuss, as if they were like sort of old Southern Gothic playwrights. This really sort of like dramatic purple sort of language. And I just did it as a joke, not thinking this is going to be a comic. And Marie again contacted me and said, "Hey, by the way, your Snagglepuss comic has been approved." And I hadn't even pitched a Snagglepuss comic, but at that point, I'm not going to say no. So then I began to think about the story and what I wanted to actually do with the Snagglepuss comic, and I really built it around sort of two two pillars. One, that I knew that Snagglepuss had a background in theater, because all his
Hmm.
catchphrases are theater phrases. Exit
Yeah,
station left and Heavens to Murgatroyd
Evan's
are both
Murgatroyd.
theater reference.
Um,
And also that he's a gay icon. That so I really just built the story around those two sort of starting points.
I did not know that he was a gay icon before you got on him.
Yeah, he's become a gay icon, I think, because the fact that he's a pink lion. So visually, he's very much in the you visually representative uh, of the movement that's adopted, the lavender triangle, and also I think they just took his background in theater and his affectations as like a sign that he's that he is someone who's like sort of gender fluid.
And with the Flintstones, that the Flintstones came first. How did you pitch that? How did you get it approved? Were you thinking that it might not be approved? It is a little out there.
I
Like,
think they gave me the Flintstones. They offered it to me because I think they wanted to sort of apologize for the fact that Prez was canceled so early.
mhm.
Because initially we were planning for 12 issues of Prez, and they canceled it after 6, which I didn't even know they could do. Because I'd written books before. I'd never had a book canceled halfway through. So I didn't realize that once they approved me for 12 issues that I might only get 6. But it was also just sort of lucky that at the same time they canceled um, Prez, DC had also acquired Hanna-Barbera properties.
Yeah.
So as a writer who was already in their stable, and they knew that they liked my work on Prez, even though it didn't sell for squat. I was already sort of in the chamber waiting to work on another project. So they gave me the Flintstones instead of Prez.
And early on in the Flintstones, I mean, even in the Flintstones, you're already tackling themes like religion, which is a common theme throughout your work. Uh, Personally speaking, is that reflective of your own stance on religion?
Yeah, I think that religion is sort of a story we have to tell ourselves to find our connection in the universe. I think everyone's got a religion, whether they want to or not. The religion is basically whatever makes them feel like their existence wasn't a mistake. So for some people it's Christianity, for some people it's Islam, for some people it's tennis. It's but whatever makes you feel like I have a place in the universe, and this is where I'm meant to be. And it's about finding that thing that makes sense of the universe to you.
And even then, starting from God is Disappointed in You and the Flintstones, and obviously with Second Coming, you were skewering religion. It's like, how important is it to you in 2016 onwards to be doing this in this particular, point in history?
Well, I think what I'm satirizing is not religion itself, but the institutionalization of religion.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that, like, oh, this person really needs help, I bet I can make some money off of that. Or the idea that, well, if this works for me, then it's got to work for you too. If I'm enjoying the chicken, and everyone here in the restaurant's got to have the chicken, the sort of hubris that comes from taking something personal and spiritual and meaningful like religion and turning it into like a business or an army or a government.
Before we move on to Second Coming, I'm going to ask, what's it like working with Shannon Wheeler, Mike Feehan, and Steve Pugh?
Yeah, they're all very different. Shannon, is very outgoing, and he knows exactly what he wants to do, and he has his own style. He came sort of fully formed. So for Shannon, it was just kind of, I just had to sort of buckle myself in for the ride, because he was going, I'd send him the pages and he would draw the cartoons, and whatever he came up with was what we went with. Steve was very different. Steve's a brilliant artist, but he was very, I think, much more shy. He wanted me to sort of like talk a lot more about what I was looking into, and he really riffed, I think, more off of my vision. I mean, he does have his own sort of very distinct style, but he wanted to really make sure that he understood the world that we were creating together, and understood what it was I was trying to say. He took the words very seriously before he even started drawing, and I think it shows in the artwork that what he really captures are the sort of emotions, the subtleties that were in the script that could have been easily missed if you just thought, oh, well, it's just going to be a comedy, or oh, it's just going to be an homage to the old Flintstones. You might have missed the nuances of relationships between, like, the bowling ball and the vacuum cleaner. But he didn't, because he really paid a lot of attention to the scripts, and he really wanted to inhabit the world that I'd created with my words with his art. And Mike, I think this was his first major, big two comic book, doing Snagglepuss. And he, like me, is a history buff. He's like somebody who really is into, like, sort of the Cold War history. So I made sure to, like, give him as much freedom as possible in creating, his own sort of historical backdrops and his own sort of look for things. And so, but it was very collaborative in the sense that, we went back and forth and we talked a lot about the designs and stuff. So they're all very different artists, but you learn to work with the artist and imbue their personality into your vision.
When I was reading Snagglepuss in particular, I was trying to imagine what it would look like if you told the exact same story, but you didn't use those established characters, if you used, humans. And personally, I'm not sure if it would land as well. I can't really decide if it would have, because I think the story is good on its own. Do you think the fact that you used these characters, or established characters, much less anthropomorphic characters, what does it add to the story that you wrote?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that was some of the criticism I got from Snagglepuss too, is that, like, this doesn't necessarily need to be a Snagglepuss story. This could be a story not using these characters at all. But I think that what you would lose if it weren't that was sort of the cultural equity, the sort of feelings and emotions that people bring to these characters already, the assumptions that they have about these characters, which then allow you to subvert their assumptions and their expectations, which you don't have if you're starting with a completely new character that you just made up. They have no expectations to subvert. And I think in a lot of ways that was one of the major points that we were trying to make with Snagglepuss, is that you don't really know somebody based upon their celebrity. You don't really know them because of their public profile. You have to see who they are when they're not showing you who they are to really understand them.
And how much of Snagglepuss's speech to the congressional committee is you?
Did I write?
No, is your personal view?
Yeah, I think there's that moment probably in every comic I do where it's the character sort of falls away and it's just me talking directly to the reader. And that was definitely, I think, that moment in the Snagglepuss comic, where in a lot of ways it was just sort of me speaking directly to the reader through Snagglepuss about, you know, what I thought our country was going through. You know, the Trump era had just started, and about what I saw as the challenges to our civilization that we were about to confront.
The next thing that you're known for is Second Coming, which was supposed to be a Vertigo book.
Right.
You want to walk us through what happened there? I got Richard's point of view on it, but I want to hear it from you as well.
It's probably pretty similar. But yeah, it started out, it was going to be a Vertigo book. And then it must have been a slow news day or something, but Fox News got a hold of the fact that we were doing a comic book about Jesus Christ at Vertigo, i.e. DC, and they ran with it as like sort of a social, like a culture war story. And then it got picked up by all kinds of conservative outlets, and they were all running like DC's making fun of Jesus Christ, which was weird because, you know, nobody had read a single page of the comic book yet. It wasn't out. It was just approved. And all I knew were like maybe like the one or two sentences of solicitation that we had released. And then there was, next thing I know,
it's not making fun of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and it does not.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I figured. I figured anybody who might sort of look askance at it, or, you know, feel a little weird about the subject, they wouldn't feel that way once they'd actually read it. If they gave it enough chance to actually read a comic, they'd see what it was about, and they would understand that it was in no way like an assassination attempt on Christ. In fact, you know, I was maybe lulled into a false sense of security by the fact that we had to go through the same thing with God is disappointed in you, where it sounds like a very sort of potentially sacrilegious or abusive book, but when you read it, it's actually it's very respectful to the Bible, and it tries to actually get it right.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically just another view, but one that earnestly struggles with the subject matter and wants to understand it on its own terms. And that's the way I felt people would react to Second Coming. But, you know, because of the furor that was created around this book that didn't even exist yet, there was a petition circulating that got hundreds of thousands of signatures, each one of which, you know, auto-generated an angry email that went directly to Dan DiDio's inbox.
Wow.
In fact, we were joking about it later. Like, you know, he said, next time you come to LA, I'm going to make you clean out my inbox. It's like got like 300,000 of these emails. But you know, he, to his credit, he wanted to stand by it because he understood what it was and what it wasn't. And but, you know, there was all this transition at the corporate level. DC had just been bought by AT&T. There was a new president. So it was just a little too hot for them to handle. I think the feeling there was, you know, we're here to sell Batman lunch pails and Superman t-shirts, and how does a comic book about Jesus Christ help us do any of that? And, you know, from that standpoint, they're absolutely right. It does not help. So they politely asked me to take to take Second Coming somewhere else where it would be loved, and which they're very gracious about. I have no hard feelings. You know, obviously I'm still working with DC on a lot of projects.
Yeah.
And they let me keep the money they paid me to write it. So I was, you know, okay with taking it to another publisher. And so, yeah, then we took it to Ahoy. And Ahoy, in a lot of ways, was kind of the exact opposite, in that they were a brand new company. They weren't selling any Batman lunch pails. So they wanted the publicity. They wanted the controversy because it was something that could help put them on the map. And for better or worse, I think it did.
Yeah. I'm going to move back a bit. Richard said something about the Batman penis thing playing a factor.
Oh, right. Yeah, no, it was bad timing too, because the whole controversy over Second Coming happened right around the same time as the whole Batwing controversy, where DC DC Black Label had accidentally released a panel showing Batman's penis. And so then the corporate level just went sort of ballistic, and they wanted to shut down everything that was seen as even slightly untoward. They were taking control of the brand back because they thought we were playing with the crown jewels and were endangering, you know, the kingdom. So Second Coming, I mean, I think they probably would have ultimately asked us to go anyway, just because of the heat surrounding it, but that didn't help.
What I gotta say, that issue of Batman, like I've never bought a comic for the sole purpose of wanting to sell it, but that was the first time where I was like,
Yeah,
I should do it. I got to the store and it was out. Everyone had the same
heads
idea.
up enough to, oh yeah, you know, whoever got like comps for that probably made a pretty penny, like selling them on eBay. It would have been worth it to be like the letterer or the inker on that Batman, because you could clean up just with your comps.
How did you pitch Second Coming? Like, what was in the proposal?
Well, it actually, I was in Burbank, I was in LA, meeting with Dan Didio and Marie Javins, because I wanted to pitch a Superman comic. So I was pitching all these Superman ideas, and Dan was just shooting them down one after another. He's like, "That's been done. That's been done. We've seen that." And at one point, he stops me and he says, "Look, this character's been around for 80 years. It's going to be really hard to come up with an idea that hasn't been done at some point." And so I said, "Well, I got this idea. I was reluctant to bring it up, but it's be about Superman sharing an apartment with Jesus Christ." And he said, "Well, that's not been done." So they said, but he said, "You know what? I get death threats if Superman refuses to say the Pledge of Allegiance. So why don't you make it a creator-owned title and we'll publish it in Vertigo?" And that's sort of how Second Coming was born.
Oh wow! So you pitched it as a Superman. So you're a big Superman fan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm glad he pushed me in that direction, because it would have been, oh, sorry, cat.
It's okay. People love cats. It'll get clicks.
But but yeah, the fact that if it had been Superman, it would have been harder to pull off, because you would have had two nice guys. You would have had two people who were both really super nice. So the fact that it was like a creator-owned character, which became Sunstar, allowed me to make the counterpart to Jesus a lot sort of more animosity, a lot more unlike him.
Yeah, a little bit more unlikable.
Yeah, and also just more sort of the antipathy of Christ's philosophy, where this guy just solves all his problems with force, and he's like, you know, has the sort of demeanor of like a street cop, you know, where he's seen it all and he's jaded and he knows how much corruption and violence there is in the world. So he sees the world very, very differently than somebody who wants to heal people and, you know, forgive wrongdoers.
As a Superman fan, you know, ever since the Christopher Reeve movie, there's been that kind of comparison between Superman and Jesus. Before that, Superman's more of a Moses figure. Where do you think the similarities begin and end with Superman and Jesus?
Well, I think that they begin in that they're both very altruistic people. They are earnestly wanting to do the best for the human race, to help the human race survive. I think where they end is that Christ sees that very much as the human race's like challenge to transform itself, to change as human beings, to become to the point where they can save themselves, or they can transform themselves into people that live differently. And whereas Superman sees it very much as his mission to save the human race from external threats like asteroids and aliens and you know, villains,
And just kind of let humanity find its own way.
yeah.
That's the case. And I notice, you know, you've mentioned her a few times at this point, Marie Javins. How instrumental is she to your career?
Oh, she was the one who discovered me. Yeah. She was the one, like I mentioned earlier, who found offered me Prez and was there at the pitch meeting for Second Coming. And so yeah, incredibly instrumental. and also she was my editor on like Prez, the Flintstones, and Snagglepuss. So I mean, she was really the one who sort of taught me how to write a comic book.
I feel like she's always pushing for like something new when it comes to comics. Is it?
Yeah,
Would
I
that be
really
this?
do think that that's sort of what motivates her, is like wanting to do something interesting, not wanting to do like the same sort of Justice League comic you've seen 50 times.
Yeah.
Her attitude is like very much not like, well, good enough. This will work. Just put it out there. She's like, her attitude is like, well, that's kind of boring. Let's do something interesting.
How's it feel being back at DC and having her as the big boss now?
It's great. You know, I think she really deserves it, and I think one of the reasons why she deserves it is because she has vision. She's not just somebody who's like, well, okay, I'll shit out an okay Aquaman comic, and you know, people will buy it just because they don't know any better. She really wants to create interesting stories and interesting titles. So, and I think that it's probably good to have a visionary like that at the helm.
Okay. Getting back to Second Coming, what would you say is the difference between working at DC versus working at Ahoy?
Well, Ahoy's much more of like a cottage. It's less of a, a corporate atmosphere than DC, obviously. So you have a lot more autonomy. You can get away with what you want. You don't have to worry about like continuity or, getting sued. So you have a lot more freedom to do what you want. But you also, as the other side of that coin, don't have all the resources for like marketing and publicity. So you have to do a lot of your own sort of promotion work to get people to find out about your titles, and the stores aren't going to necessarily just carry it just because it's an Ahoy book. Whereas if you're publishing something with DC, stores are probably going to carry it just by virtue of the fact that it's a DC title.
When this whole thing started, I called you controversial, irreverent, subversive. I think we've covered all of those descriptions at one point. But with the controversy from Vertigo to Ahoy, um, how did it feel? 3 years into your comic writing career, how did it feel like being at the center of so much controversy?
It didn't feel that bad. I never felt like I was like in hot soup or danger. And I always kind of, my philosophy has always kind of been like, if the work is good, if you believe in the work, then nothing can really hurt you. And if you don't believe in the work, then no amount of publicity or marketing can save you. So it's really all comes down to the work. And that might be delusion on my part, but I feel like as long as you feel comfortable with the work, as long as you feel like confident that this is what you wanted to say and you did a good job at it, then everything else is just kind of a detail. The rest of it just sort of works itself out one way or another.
I think one of the things that makes Second Coming work really well is that you have, God and Jesus talking, in this really modern way, really casually modern way. But then it's depicted by Richard in this like super detailed, ornate way with their traditional clothes. Like, what's it like working with Richard Pace?
Yeah, Richard's great. And I think one of the things I like about working with Richard is that he really gets like, sort of like Steve, like those sort of emotional nuances between the characters, and it really shows in the artwork. And the scenes in Second Coming look different based upon where they are taking place. Like the scenes in heaven are much more sort of hyper real and almost science fictiony, whereas the scenes from Christ's past 2,000 years ago on Earth look much muddier, dingier, inexact lines. And the scenes in the present day on Earth look sort of like a combination between the two. And that's a very intentional decision on Richard's part. That was Richard's idea to give the work that sort of difference in looks. And he was also his idea to bring Leonard on
Yeah.
to do a lot of the artwork to give it that sort of extra dimension, which I think is panned out really well, and it's added a dimension to the reading that people may not even be aware of as they're reading it. But when you're done, you kind of realize that this was part of a clever part of the world building.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of the subversion of it is it, Richard stuff looks realistic. It looks serious. And then you start reading it. And
Yeah,
it's more, I don't even, it's more satirical, would you say?
yeah, and I think that's good when you're writing something that's humorous or satirical. you don't want the artwork to match it. You don't want it to be a wacky, people mugging and making faces and stuff, because then you're overselling it. And you're whereas if people are just sort of in normal dramatic or even like sad situations, and you have these sort of sad satiric lines to go with it, then it really resonates a lot more. It hits a lot harder because it's the lines are allowed to sort of exist on their own. They're allowed to breathe.
It's funny
Right,
and sad at the same time.
Yeah, and the way the lines don't really have a chance to breathe if the characters are like doing like these Bazooka Joe backflips, or they're constantly mugging at the reader.
How much input did you have on the design process with Richard?
We talked a lot about the character design, and it's one of the issues that came up early on in the conversations was how white looking to make Jesus, because obviously Jesus, having lived in Nazareth in the first century of the Common Era, was not a white guy.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we wanted him to be recognizable to people in Baptist churches in the United States as their Jesus, as the Jesus they worship, because those were the sort of expectations we were trying to subvert. Those were the people that we were trying to reach and say, well, this is what your Christ would actually think if he came to earth today. And so we tried to sort of come up with this medium, this balance between the two, between the authentically Semitic Jesus of first century Judea, and then also somebody who would also be recognizable to anybody who is worshiping Jesus in a Southern Baptist church in the United States.
And what was the decision to make him, so he's basically dressed in traditional Jesus clothes, but he's also a little browner.
Yeah.
And he's also short.
Yeah. Which I don't think is, I think that probably would have been pretty typical of somebody back then, a low protein diet.
Yeah.
And also it kind of makes him, it sort of disambiguates him a lot from Sunstar. It kind of accentuates the contrast between these two figures.
And that's interesting that you mentioned that you were trying to reach certain people. I grew up Roman Catholic, but I've spent a lot of my life questioning that and everything. I feel like when reading it, I'm more reading it and it's affirming what I believe in. So there is a bit of a preaching to the choir when it comes to me reading it. So were you actually, in fact, aiming it towards people who are super religious and basically probably don't question their beliefs?
Well, I wanted, ideally, I wasn't trying to like say, well, this is a comic for X. Ideally, I'd want anybody to read it, but because it's, I think, got the larger, more universal issue of like, well, there are ways to save the human race that don't entail violence. And in fact, violence is only really useful for a very small percentage of humanity's problems. And for all the others, you're going to need things like compassion, cooperation. You're going to need people to transform themselves into decent human beings for these problems to be solved. But I definitely wanted those people who did grow up like I did in sort of evangelical, white middle class and working class churches to recognize their Jesus and this Jesus, and to think about how different a Christ who behaves like Christ is from the Christ that is being sold to them in their sort of prosperity gospel, name it and claim it, evangelical churches.
Pray for it and you'll get it. That kind of
thing.
Yeah.
God wants you to be rich. Those sorts of doctrines.
That's interesting. Would you mind walking us through your personal religious journey throughout your life?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, I was raised in an evangelical church, probably a pretty common thing for the United States, where there's not a lot of scholarship involved. They don't take a very scholarly tack on the Bible. It's more emotively based, about like feeling that, you've got Jesus in your heart. And one thing I noticed growing up was that we got a lot of people, and this is partially because I grew up in the 80s. So we got a lot of people who burned out on drugs in the 70s, like people who were like hippies, and then like, joined cults or whatever and got into a lot of drugs, and then crashed and burned at some point in the 1970s. And Christianity, born again Christianity, was sort of the thing that allowed them to sort of get their lives back together. So, and I think for a lot of them, it was, and for me too, for a long time, it was sort of like the drug of choice, where the person who used to be on heroin, or who used to take LSD 3 times a day, would suddenly get that feeling of euphoria, or that high by singing in church and playing the tambourine and dancing in place, and that was enough to get them to go another week without shooting up, or getting drunk, or doing anything else, that the other behaviors that they were trying to quit. So I think in a lot of ways that's what evangelicalism is. It's like a dopamine rush to the people who are in there, and it operates very much more um, like a drug, or a cult, I think, than like a traditional Protestant or Catholic Christian religion. It's very much more about engaging the people and making them feel like they're part of some movement, and that giving them a direct emotional experience, which I think is one of the reasons why it was sort of the movement that created the mega churches, because it's a lot easier to have that sort of Nuremberg effect where everyone feels like we're on a holy mission when you're surrounded by 10,000 other people all singing and doing the same exact thing that you are.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and also, the commercialism of the mega churches, the stores, and the passing of the plate, and all the little sort of like add-ons, extra buys, I think ties in perfectly with sort of the prosperity doctrine they teach to other people.
Donate to our church and you'll be saved.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like salvation for $3.99,
Yeah.
And I think that once people buy into that, like, oh, if I'm not rich, then I must be doing something wrong. If I'm struggling financially, it's because I have not done enough to earn God's favor. Once people buy into that, then they don't think twice about the fact that they're actually being ripped off by the church that is supposed to be serving them.
And when would you say you walked out of that system?
I left when I was, well, for a long time. I think I checked out mentally probably when I was like 14 or 15.
Mm-hmm.
I just started having, especially as I, went to school and began learning more about the way the world actually operated and how different it was than what I had been taught in church. I began to sort of like check out of church gradually, because I realized that I was being lied to. I didn't know what the truth was. I just knew that it wasn't this. But then when I was 18 and I moved out of home to go to college, I was pretty much done with it. I never went back to church again because I didn't have to.
You
I
never
was
even
allowed to.
tried to like rekindle that faith or anything?
No, although I kind of for a long time went the opposite way, where I just thought, well, this is all nonsense and these are just idiots, and the Bible's is garbage. But then when I started writing God Is Disappointing You, it sort of allowed me to sort of rehabilitate my image of Christianity and of the Bible, where I was like, no, it's not garbage. There's a lot of wisdom here, and there's a lot of things that you could really find meaning in. It just wasn't what I was given when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I was taught like the 1% of the Bible that was useful to them, to get me
Yeah.
to like eat my carrots, to get me to shut up and not have sex with anybody. But those were, that's just a tiny bit of the Bible. The actual Bible is full of all kinds of wisdom. And it's also, I think what's most profound about the Bible is the fact that it does contradict itself. That
Yeah.
because it's written by 66 different authors, all struggling with the same question: what does God want from me? And they come up with sometimes radically different answers. And I don't see that as something that undermines the Bible, or that sort of like diminishes it at all. I see that as like something that humanizes it, that makes it much more personal. It's like, well, you might like this answer that this author came up with, but not this other one. You might not find as much meaning in that, but it's the struggle that gives it the meaning, not the answers per se.
This is interesting because I've found that the people who write the most satirical stuff about the Bible tend to be the people who actually, read it.
Yeah, no, it's really hard, I think, to read the Bible and to understand it, the historical context, without finding a lot of stuff really funny about it,
Exactly.
or to like sort of like raise your eyebrows and go, "Oh God, this is not what I was taught in school." Uh, they're so anytime somebody says they believe that the Bible is the literal word of God, for a fact they didn't understand the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you know, Second Coming got pulled out of Vertigo because the controversy was that you were making fun of Jesus. Jesus is the best character in the book.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I wanted him to be. I wanted him to be sort of the one who carries the weight of truth, the one who like understands that it's not about like, you know, shutting people down and sort of like forcing people to pretend to be good. It's about the person. He's the one who can actually show us how to transform ourselves to actually become better people, so we don't have to pretend.
If they had said you were making fun of God, I could see that.
Yeah. Well, in a
Because
lot of ways,
Old
it's
Testament God is kind of
yeah.
yeah.
Well, in a lot of ways, the book is sort of based on my my Christian upbringing, and there is a lot to sort of square away if you're raised as a Christian between the God of the Old Testament and the Christ of the New. Uh, if I were writing this from a more Jewish perspective, I'd have a much different perspective, I think, on God. That, you know, God wouldn't be this sort of tyrannical jerk who's just smiting people with lightning bolts. He would be much more, I think, like a force of nature, where it's
Yeah.
just like you can't have your cake and eat it too. You know, if you want justice, you've got to have order. You know, if in that God would be written differently. But because it's from the Christian background that I grew up with, so much of what he does is antithetical to what we were taught Christ is supposed to be about, and in fact, what Christ is about in the New Testament. In fact, the Gnostics who wrote these non-canonical gospels, one of the central problems of their faith was reconciling the Old Testament God with the forgiving Christ of the New Testament, and in the Acts of Bartholomew, they came up with a rather novel sort of explanation, and the explanation they came up with was that God had created the Earth, but then He had other planets to go create, so He left, and while He was away creating these other planets, He put two angels in charge of the Earth, and that these two jerks, this middle management that He put in charge of the Earth, were the ones who were smiting people and being cruel and you know passing down all these laws. And then when He came back and saw what a mess they'd made of the place, He had to then send His Son Jesus Christ to fix everything. And that was how they sort of explained why the God of the Old Testament is so different than the God of the New Testament. In Second Coming, it's much more simple than that. It's
What
just
a
that
no prize.
it's just that people
Yeah.
disagree.
Yeah.
That fathers and sons don't see the world the same way.
That's interesting. I've never heard of that. Um, and what makes parody, what makes satire the right way to, I mean, the way for you to reach out to people who might be resistant to changing their minds?
Well, I think that the good thing about satire is that it it forces people to think about something that they had always taken for granted. That's which is kind of what satire is. I think it's tackling the things that people thought they knew and making them realize they didn't know it as well as they thought they did. And I think also inherent in satire is punching up, like sort of you're speaking truth to power.
Yeah.
It's not satirical. You know, two frat guys beating up a homeless guy is not satirical. That's just like sadistic.
Yeah.
Satirical is, you know, like God tripping over a homeless guy and falling and, you know, collapsing, falling on his face. That's more satirical. So I think in a way that's that because I have these opinions and they're opinions about things that are so much bigger and more important than I am, that naturally lends itself to satire.
Um, and tell me about Leonard Kirk and how important it was to get him on the book.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, he adds like a whole dimension to the book that just wouldn't exist without him. And that he makes the scenes seem like, you know, they're like a different place, a different world, and he is just a really great compliment to Richard. And it was just I think I'm really glad that he's on board. And I love his artwork. The in the second issue, which comes out next Wednesday, he did most of the artwork for this new character who's contemplating suicide because he's been left alone, been left by his wife, and it's just him and his cat. And it's probably my favorite, one of my favorite subplots in the entire series. And it works because his artwork is just so human and so intimate that it works a lot better than it would if it had just been my words.
How do you respond to people who, I mean, you said something about punching up. How do you respond to people, some fans, some creatives? I'm thinking of a particular movie director who say that it's impossible to write anything funny now. Clearly, that's
Oh,
not.
I disagree. I think, but that's the key. It's like it's I have no problem. I have a problem when I'm writing about bigger subjects, more powerful institutions, and gods and stuff, not being funny about it. It's a more of a challenge for me to play it straight than it is for me to find the humor in it. But I think the key is that you are not dehumanizing people. You're not like kicking somebody who's down, or you're not like further marginalized communities, but you are finding the humor in the people who are supposed to know everything, and and supposed to be in control of everything, and how little they actually have control of. um and to me, so it's like it's a you people who think that humor is impossible now probably were never very funny to begin with, because they were looking in the wrong directions.
I'm gonna ask one of those. How did you come up with that idea? Questions. In heaven, there is a food court that is made up of food chains that have closed down. How did you come up with that?
That was actually one of the first ideas I had when I was writing the series, was like, because of heaven being populated by these people who died before, and also because one of the ideas was that like God created people to come up with ideas, because creating's hard. It's not easy to create ideas out of nothing. So he created humans so that they would make interesting foods. They would make, they would write plays and novels, and come up with cool looking buildings, because he didn't have the time or energy to do all of that on his own, and they would become a source of entertainment for him. So the idea is that the later in human history you see heaven, the more stuff there is out there. By the time Sunstar goes up to heaven, it's like Earth 2020 AD. They've got like food courts, they've got cars, they've got jets and stuff. Whereas before, when you see heaven, when Christ is up there, when God quits the earth, it's all kind of stuff that they would have had back in ancient times. So the idea is that you would have all these ideas that people created, like being the stuff that populates heaven, that this is the stuff that God actually enjoyed, and this is the reason why he created people, so he could eat at like a Rax or at a Burger Chef or something. The idea that they're all defunct fast food places and stuff was just sort of like a joke, based upon like, well, this is where they go when they die. They go to the food court in heaven.
I like the
But
idea that God created humanity and then just kind of let it run itself. I feel like that's indicative of a writer's brain as well.
yeah, in some way you kind of have to turn the stories over to themselves. You have to let the characters sort of be organic to who they want to be. Like I mentioned earlier, it would have been a disaster if I tried to force the Sunstar character to be Superman over and over. I had to like free him to be Sunstar, to follow his own path. uh, but I think there's frustration in that too, because you want to have the control but you don't have it. That's the price you pay for giving these creations free will, and that's a frustration God discovers really early on, where he's like a guy who thought it'd be a good idea to like order squirrel monkeys out of a catalog, and then they're just like fucking all day, in the apartment, or tearing up his drapes. And that's kind of the way he views human race. It's like, oh God, they're not doing anything I want them to do. They're just killing each other, and that's why he gets disgusted and leaves.
We're recording this on February 13th, my time, February 12th, your time. Next week, it's going to be the second issue of the second season. You call it a season? The second volume
Yeah,
of Second Coming.
second season.
How do you, like, what's in store for the second season of Second Coming?
Well, the second season is very much about Christ trying to develop his new flock of disciples, his new posse. And also, we see a lot more of heaven, and the process of like getting your housing assignments and settling into heaven, and what that's like. And also about like Sunstar and Sheila like preparing to have a baby.
And how do you have a set end for Second Coming?
Yeah, Ideally, it would go for probably about 4 volumes for series, and I know where it would end when if it gets that far.
Is Jesus gonna die?
No,
Okay.
I'll tell you right now, he won't. But
Yeah, I was like, is he gonna die again? Okay. Let's move on to your work at Future State, Superman Imperious Lex, Superman and Imperious Lex. How's that going? How'd that
it's going
go?
good. Well, it's going really well now that it's all done on my end. It's all kind of it's all kind of in Steve's court now. So, but yeah, it's there's only going to be 3 issues, and they're all written. So it's but the artwork I'm still getting from Steve is just amazing. So I'm really I'm always happy to work with Steve on anything. But you know, I've always wanted to do a Superman series too. So this is a really wonderful opportunity for me on a lot of levels.
You're finally working on Superman.
Yeah, yeah, I got the actual Superman series, and I got it with an artist who I love working with. So what could be better?
And I've noticed the feedback on Future State among creators has been that it's been very fun to work on it.
Yeah,
I think every time there's been an event or something, the feedback I see from creators has been mixed. Like some people like it, and some people are like, why can't they just let us do our stories
yeah.
or whatever? But Future
Well,
State
I think
looks,
that
well
the
loved across the whole spectrum.
yeah, and I think the big thing is that they let people sort of they've kind of freed them up. They didn't have to tie into anything. They didn't have to worry about continuity. It was much more liberating to be able to just sort of tell your own story without having to worry about what other people were doing.
And after Future State, can we expect something from you from DC?
Yeah, I've got another thing. I've got a couple things actually that have been greenlit. One of which I'm earnestly working on. I can't really talk about because it hasn't been announced yet. But yeah, more in the pipeline for DC, and then of course I'm working on the Fantastic Four thing from Marvel.
Fantastic Four life story. Can you tell us about what's going to happen there? Because
Yeah,
I know life story
so,
from Spider-Man. I know what the
right.
concept,
It's sort of the same concept where they age in real time. Each there's 6 issues, and each issue is about a different decade. First issue number 1 is the 60s, and issue number 2 is the 70s, and so forth. And they age in real time, and characters come and they go. And I think what's maybe different about this approach than what Chip did to amazing effect in the Spider-Man life story was that because it's an ensemble cast, because there's 4 of them, I actually have a different character narrating each issue.
Oh,
so like there's like the 60s is all seen from like sort of Reed's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of the one telling the story and narrating, and the 70s is from Sue's perspective, and then the 80s is like Johnny's decade, and it kind of rotates like that.
Wait, there's 6 issues, so
Yeah,
who are the other
but
two?
I don't want to get ahead of myself, but there are different narrators for the last 2 as well.
Okay,
But I don't want to like get
I'll leave
that.
it to the fans to guess who they're going to be.
Right.
And with Fantastic Four life story, I mean, there's the Fantastic Four has been announced to be coming to the MCU. I think there's no I don't think there's a coincidence that when Marvel was able to get the rights back, all of a sudden the Fantastic Four project suddenly started coming in. But there's talk among the fan community as well as the creative community that Fantastic Four essentially must start in the 60s. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that's really sort of central to their mythology, because they are very much about this sort of the optimism of like the space race, and kind of where the optimism of the 60s kind of went wrong. I think that or where it was sort of disappointed by later generations, and I think that this is like really a good starting point for them, is about how the promise that technology held for our lives is also sort of the threat that could destroy us too. And I think that's really crucial to the beginning of their mythology, where they were going into space on this fantastic journey, but then it there was a horrible accident that basically turned them all into freaks, and then they're having to fend off alien invasions every 6 weeks, and so I think that the original Fantastic Four is very much about this sort of infatuation with technology that we had in the 60s, that it could be the thing that saves us or destroys us.
Do you have a particular favorite Fantastic Four character?
I think my favorite is Reed, just because I feel like he has a lot of internal stuff that he never deals with. So I like to imagine what that is. I mean, obviously the most fun one is kind of Ben,
Yeah.
just because he's so extroverted and he's got a funny way of talking. But I think as a writer, the one that sort of like makes me think, and also Sue has that same sort of thing where you can imagine a lot going through her mind that she never gets to say on the page because of her role.
Yeah, it's weird because I think if you ask a bunch of comic book fans who their favorite Fantastic Four character is, the most common answer will be Ben. But then if you ask a bunch of Fantastic Four fans and writers who their favorite character is, the most common answer is Reed.
Yeah, it's not surprising. I think because, like I mentioned earlier, the interiority that writing gives you, he seems to have a lot of lend himself a lot to that sort of like introspection.
And just to close off the interview, um, you've been writing comics for 6 years at this point. Basically you've made a real name for yourself. You've helped put Ahoy on the map. You've you've done the Flintstones. You've done Snagglepuss. You're working on Fantastic Four. You're working on Superman. How's it feel coming so far in such a short time?
It doesn't feel like a short time to me. It feels like a long time. But I love the opportunities that comics have given me. It's allowed me to actually make my living as a writer. I don't have to have a day job. Like I would have had a day job to the day I died if I had tried to like continue writing books. Uh, so yeah, comics has been just an amazing journey for me. I'm so glad that I got a chance to work in this medium.
Thank you, Mr. Mark Russell. This was
Thanks.
great.